Hello, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to continue to talk about some of the core principles in cultural anthropology. In other words, what is it that anthropologists do, cultural anthropologists, that is, and how do we do it? Thanks once again for listening to the two podcast episodes and for completing that quiz on Scholar. Okay, so let's talk about methods, right? What are the actual methods that cultural anthropologists use to do their work? Well, one of those that we haven't talked about yet is life history. Right? So, cultural anthropologists, particularly if they're working with an individual who is middle-aged or older, might do a series of interviews in which they try to better understand that person's life history, and that to see the patterns and events that emerge from that life and that tell us something broader and larger about the society or culture as a whole. Anthropologists do a lot of interviews. We do both formal interviews and informal interviews. By formal interviews, I simply mean that we will come to an interview with a list of questions, right, and go down the list. But most of the time, cultural anthropologists engage in conversation, informal conversation with our interlocutors. So we would consider that to be an informal interview, right? If you're doing participant observation and ethnographic fieldwork, living in a community for an extended period of time, as I'll describe later, you will simply have conversations with people. Okay, this brings us to participant observation. Again, the in-depth, long-term participation and observation of a human community, right? That we are both observing within that community and participating in that community, right? It becomes sort of oxymoronic. It becomes a kind of paradoxical experience in the sense that, right, how can you participate and observe at the same time? Well, anthropologists participate in a culture, but we also need to know when to step back and to record our observations in a notebook or through the camera or whatnot. Okay, so for this class, you were to have read the piece by the Nakarema, or on the Nakarema rather, Body Ritual Among the Nakarema. So I'd like to know your thoughts. Where does this ethnography take place? You just read this whole article about a particular place. Where is the Nakarema? Where are the Nakarema people? Now, some of you may have figured this out while reading, others may have Googled, right? But in fact, this is an article about body ritual among the Americans. This is not an actual ethnography. This is sort of a satirical piece. The writer was kind of satirizing anthropology, making fun of anthropology in a way, by writing about American culture in a way that's kind of overly exoticized. So to give you some examples, some clues or hints into how this is really about America, the figure Noctin Hassa is actually Washington spelled backwards. Right, the mouth ritual, for example, is about brushing one's teeth. The witch doctor is really sort of describing a therapist, right? The charm box is a medicine cabinet in the bathroom, right? So, one of the things that makes this piece, one way that we know that this piece isn't an actual ethnography is that we don't hear from any interlocutors. Nobody from this culture speaks. It's rather the anthropologist describing the people in the culture, right? One thing that I found interesting about this piece as well is that hospitals are described as a space where norms are transgressed, right? It's about how bodies go naked. People of the opposite sex can examine, again, those of the opposite sex, right? This is where we see how someone is kind of imagining their culture from the way that an anthropologist might, or say some sort of outsider might, and find these moments of, that is kind of peculiar, that there is this one space in this culture where people are expected to be naked, or though someone of the opposite sex is expected to examine them or could examine them, right? But again, this is not a real ethnography. This is what I want you to take away from this, that it kind of gives you a sense of how, what it is to look at one's own culture from an anthropologist's perspective or from an outsider's perspective. But technically, it's not a real ethnography. I like this cartoon. It says, "These are humans. Normally, they are quite harmless, but if you touch their food or make fun of their beliefs, they become very aggressive." Right? So we have these outsiders watching and observing human behavior almost as an anthropologist would. But of course, as we will talk about today, that's not really how anthropologists do their work. Interlocutors are not behind glass like in a zoo. We interact with them regularly. Okay. So again, is this actually an ethnographic text? No. You read the piece. You should know that the tone, it makes it almost seem like you don't know that it's in America. Everything seems really exotic and foreign. That also is a commentary on anthropology, which traditionally has sometimes overly exoticized other cultures. Right? This text represents what we call the edict perspective, the outsider's perspective. Right? It doesn't give us a sense of how local people understand their own culture, for example. And that's important because that is one of the goals of cultural anthropology, is to give us a sense of how people locally understand or view their world, their worldview. So it is a bad example of ethnography. As I said, we don't hear from any of the interlocutors. They don't speak. It's just sort of like an outsider's interpretation. Again, it's satirical. It's sort of criticizing anthropology, and it's providing us with an exaggerated exoticization of American culture, right? Right? So it also shows how when we write ethnography, depending on the words we use, we can make another culture seem overly foreign or exotic, right? That's a particular choice. So it is sort of an example of an ethnographic account, right? Someone coming in and describing another culture, but it's also a criticism of the anthropological gaze. That's something we will, concept and a term that we will unpack throughout the course of this course. In some ways, the article Body Ritual Among the Necrema asks the reader, what does it mean to be exotic? What does it mean to be other? We're compelled as readers to ask who we are and what sorts of assumptions we have brought to the table when it comes to determining self and other. Again, we wouldn't see American culture as bizarre normally, but this article kind of makes it seem as if it is. So this brings us to kind of a famous quote that is often associated with cultural anthropology: to make the familiar strange. In other words, to make things that is familiar or everyday or normal to you, to make them feel or seem strange, but also to make the strange, something that's different from your everyday or your norm, seem familiar. Right? This is often described as one of the key goals of cultural anthropology: to upset our assumptions as students of anthropology, to trouble our understandings of what is quote unquote normal or acceptable in terms of the human experience, and to see how, from someone else's perspective, maybe some of the things that we do could be considered bizarre or abnormal. So let me provide a few examples of that here. In this particular culture, there's one day out of the year where the president selects a bird and parades it in front of cameras and the media and tells them that we will not kill this bird today. In another culture, there's a place, imagine, where small canines, like the one that's currently sleeping in my lap, right, have names. They might even have middle names. They might even have insurance policies. They have furniture, and they might even have clothing. Or in this other culture, as a pastime, people will take a piece of plastic with a magnifying glass and move it around a wooden board that has various letters and use it to determine something that is unknown or something that will happen in the future. So what I've just done here is shown you how something that you take for granted, right, like the pardoning of the turkey around Thanksgiving time, right, can, from some other culture's perspective, be seen as bizarre. In many cultures, it's considered inappropriate for dogs to be in the household, to even touch dogs. When I was doing field work in rural Madagascar, for example, actually this wasn't rural, this was in a small city in Madagascar, I was living with my host family. This was a Muslim host family. I was going for my daily jog in the morning, as I often did, and I saw a small puppy in the ditch. This puppy was alone and too small to do anything other than breastfeed, but I didn't see a mother, so surely it would probably die over time. I carried it, I brought it to the household, not thinking, and right away, my host mom gave me a weird face like, oh my gosh, get that thing out of my house, right? We talked about this as well in terms of thinking about, right, food taboos, what sorts of meat, for example, or whether or not meat, or if so, what kinds of meat are considered appropriate for consumption. Okay, now let's switch to talking about Malinowski. Do you remember who Malinowski was? Again, this is straight from the podcast. And why was Malinowski important to anthropology? He was obviously the founder of ethnography. He lived and participated within the community he studied. You know this from the podcast. He framed ethnography sometimes in the piece that you will have read for today, right, as a heroic adventure in a faraway land. This is one of the critiques that would come to fall upon the anthropology, particularly in the 1970s, when anthropologists began to be a little bit more critical of how we had traditionally exoticized or romanticized other cultures. Here, Malinowski kind of makes himself out to be the hero sometimes in his writing, how hard it was, how he pushed through, right? When obviously he benefited from the colonial European institution that he was a part of. Right? In many ways, this text is very colonial. And many modern anthropologists, cultural anthropologists nowadays, we try to collaborate with the people to whom we live and who we study, rather than kind of come and describe them and view them as objects. We view them as collaborators. But anyway, it's important to note that this is how the practice of ethnography began. That's why I have you learn about Malinowski and read this, because if you're going to know anything about cultural anthropology and ethnography, it's important to know when it began, where it began. It really kind of formally begins with Malinowski. He's very different from, or his legacy marks a stark differentiation from the armchair anthropologists who came before him. So for a little bit of context, Malinowski did fieldwork in the Trobriand Islands, which are featured here on this map off the coast of New Guinea. He was there for 2 years, from 1915 to 1916, and again from 1917 to 1918. Let's review. What is the ethnographic method? Well, the ethnographic method means that the researcher, the cultural anthropologist, will do long-term anthropological fieldwork with a particular community of study. By long-term, I mean ideally at least 12 months. Of course, this depends on whether or not the anthropologist has enough funding to allow them to do that. It's holistic, meaning that anthropologists look at all aspects of the human experience, even if they're going somewhere, say, to study jewelry making. It will be important to understand something about economics, right? How much do these jewels cost? Or maybe these jewels are being used as money to barter for other goods. You might need to know something about gender. Who wears these jewels, right? How is that practiced gendered? I'm just giving a random example. Ethnography is always an account of a way of life in a particular place at a particular time. So if we're to, say someone's to write an ethnography of life at CNU today and at this current moment, well, if someone was to read that ethnography 3 years from now, well, they would find that it's different. Things have changed, right? So again, it is simply a snapshot of the place and time. And lastly, it's really important for us as anthropologists, as ethnographers, to consider both what people do and what they say. In other words, this is something that distinguishes cultural anthropology from other disciplines. Say from psychology, where what we do is we go and we have people come into a lab and we interview them or study them for a short period of time, and then they go back out into the world. Well, anthropologists live in the community with the people we're studying for around a year. So we interview people and they tell us some things, but then we also live with them. So we see what they do and how they act. And oftentimes those two things are not the same. Right? I often refer to this as the ethnographic real versus the cultural ideal. Again, the ethnographic real and the cultural ideal. So the cultural ideal, these are the things that our interlocutors will tell us. Oh, this is how a marriage ritual works. First, we sacrifice 3 goats, right? But the ethnographic real is what the anthropologist notes that actually happens. Maybe when they went to the marriage ritual, the anthropologist noticed that there weren't any goats that were sacrificed. So that's something to follow up on. Why was that? What happened? Right? We attend to both what people say and what they do. Okay. So we try to understand the quote unquote native point of view. It's important to note, of course, that, well, let me ask you first, what is the native point of view? Is this the Edic or the Emic? You should know this, and if you don't, I suggest you go back through your notes. Of course, there is no one local or native point of view. That's kind of the point. We'll talk about that later in the semester. But again, we at least attempt to come to try to understand this perspective. Okay. It asserts a certain degree of anthropological authority. By that I mean that the reader or viewer of ethnography has to buy in. You have to sort of believe or be led to believe that the anthropologist is an expert, that they know what they're talking about, right? They have a reasonable level of expertise in this culture. So this is why anthropologists will, in their writing, use local terms, right? Try to give as much detail as possible to show this level of anthropological authority. Now, one thing we'll talk about later this semester, what happens if, say, interlocutors disagree with the anthropologist, right? Maybe critique the anthropologist. That is also something that happens and something that's very possible. Ethnography, again, is marked by an objective description of way of life by someone who knew it firsthand. We know that ethnography is never truly objective. It's always subjective. Every anthropologist will bring their own experience, their own perspective to that ethnography. But we try to be as objective as possible. So really, you can put objective in quotes here. Right? We're trying to provide some perspective on a culture that is somewhat objective. Right? Okay. I now have an activity for you to do, just sort of a fun activity. I'd like you to pull up the Google Doc and type in there, if you could do, I have a question for you. If you could do ethnographic research anywhere for 1 year, where would you go? What would you study? And what challenges would you expect to face? As always, please put your name in parentheses so I know who wrote what when I go to look over those responses. Again, thinking about this in terms of cultural anthropology. Okay. So again, method and scope is just one portion of Malinowski's much larger ethnography in the Trobriand Islands. Obviously, I've expected you to read it on your own. I can't go through it word by word for you here, but some things to consider as you read the piece. What does Malinowski argue are the best working conditions for an ethnographer? In other words, how should an ethnographer go about doing the research? What should that research look like? Where should the research live? And what does Malinowski say about ethnography as a science? He talks about science here a lot. Why is he so interested in this term science? Please note, as I've said before, this is around the same time, right, that many modern sciences were starting to become more formalized, including anthropology itself. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for listening.